Hello and welcome to the Healthy Middle Ground podcast with me, Jen Curtis. So in this episode, I want to talk about personality traits and how they predict the kinds of problems that you will have with fat loss or training. I think how our personality can play into having a problem with our weight or having a problem with getting fit and things like that. And also the sorts of obstacles that you will face when trying to lose weight. So I've been doing this coaching stuff for 4 years now online. I've been a trainer for 10 years, but I have a one-on-one online coaching program where I work very, very closely with individuals to get really good results like fat loss, building muscle, getting stronger, getting fit, that kind of thing. And I work very, very, very closely with individuals. So I get to know people really, really well. And I've always said that there are basically 3 parts to my online coaching program: nutrition, training, and psychology. Now, the nutrition and training part is actually the easy part, okay? It's the easy part in terms of the least complicated part of it. It's not rocket science. A lot of it is about re-education, about knowing the right things to do, the right levers to pull, because most people have some understanding of nutrition, but they have often misconceptions, especially when it comes to fat loss, and they're just kind of doing the wrong things and sometimes working very hard, but spinning their wheels. But then the psychology part of it is much, much, much more complicated and much more difficult from my perspective, because first of all, you have to really understand the person that's in front of you, and you have to help them overcome their obstacles, their cognitive biases, their misunderstandings, and a lot of other things that get in their way. Now, the difference between my job and a lot of other jobs is that I have to get the person to do the work. So it's about getting the person to change. If you go and get a builder, they will just build you. You can tell them what to do and they'll build you a wall or a conservatory or whatever it is that you need, right? And you pay them to do the work. If you need a programmer, you just pay them, they write the code, they do it for you. Maybe you give them feedback, but they do it for you, right? That is not how my job works. I have to give the guidance, I have to give the motivation, I have to give the right knowledge, and I have to give the right structure, and I also have to give the right support, but I can't do it for you. I can't get you to count your calories. I can't get you to pay attention to what you're eating. I can't get you to lift the weights. You have to do it. And that is a much harder thing to achieve rather than just doing it for the person. So it's a lot to do with psychology. I'm also really, really, really into personality traits and kind of like the psychology science behind all of those things. And in particular, I get a lot of I've sort of learned a lot about the Big 5 personality, which is a very, very established kind of personality test or set of kind of like criteria in psychology, where you can, and I'll link below a really great test that you can do. Jordan Peterson popularized it, but it's basically 5 big personality traits, and understanding them and understanding where you sit in terms of other people. So you get put on a spectrum of like a percentile, right? So your 44th percentile for openness, or 26th percentile for agreeableness, or whatever it is, right? You get put on into a percentile. So you can understand how you fit into the rest of the population, and you can get a report basically on how your personality traits and, you know, things that you need to watch out for and pitfalls, but also strengths. And I see a lot of that playing out in my coaching. I see certain patterns come up over and over again where certain personality traits lend themselves to either being overweight or struggling with your weight or struggling with certain aspects of health and fitness. And other personality traits are quite helpful. And if you know these things about yourself, you can know where your pitfalls lie, not just when it comes to fat loss and health, but with every area of your life. And then you can work on your weaknesses and know, you know, where your mind is maybe playing a bit of games with you. You're not seeing objective reality, but maybe seeing things through a certain lens. So understanding these personality traits It can help us predict the sorts of problems the person will experience with health, fitness, fat loss, that kind of thing. It can help us sort of unravel those problems, but it also helps me as a coach to know how to adapt myself to that person. Now, obviously, I have my own approach, and one of my guiding principles is to always be honest and always be kind. So like, I won't lie to my clients, even if that means sometimes giving them some tough love, giving them some hard pills to swallow, that sort of thing. I'm never gonna lie and tell them, an untruth, but I try to be kind about it. But obviously there are different personality types. Some people respond more well to a direct approach, and some people, need things like softening up a little bit. And so understanding personality can also help us with that kind of thing. So anyway, I've got a list of like 7 personality traits that I think help us understand these sorts of things. So let's just dive into it. Okay, so the first personality trait is conscientiousness, okay, which is basically how important it is to you to do a good job. And conscientiousness as a personality trait is divided up into 2 different things. It's divided up into industriousness, which is basically how productive you are, and then orderliness, which is how much you create order in the world. But together, conscientiousness is basically a marker of how hardworking you are. And this might sound controversial to say, and a lot of this podcast might sound controversial to say, but it is a fairly innate trait that you can't really teach someone. Some people are just innately more conscientious than others, and some people are just not very conscientious and don't want to work very hard and are a little bit lazy. I know, we're only a few minutes into this podcast, I'm already labeling people, but this is a really big thing to understand. Some people will just do the work, and I've seen that time and time again through my coaching. Some people, you just give them the task to do, they just do it, they show up and do it over and over again. And other people just won't do it, and they'll have a million reasons, a million excuses, but they just won't show up and do it. And this does lend itself enormously. If you're a conscientious person, if you're hard work, if you value hard work and doing hard things and overcoming hard things, you will be more successful in these sorts of pursuits as well as others. I've had people join the program when, other people have paid for it, or have, kind of heard from other people that they've gotten great results, but then they just don't do the work themselves, and so they just don't get the results. Conscientious people tend to be able to hold themselves accountable, and see it as important to hold up a certain standard and try and live up to that. They're often ambitious, they're driven, they want to improve, they want to learn, they want to change. And then there's also the side of orderliness and organization, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. Now, the downsides of conscientiousness are that it can lead to perfectionism, and too much perfectionism, too much kind of emphasis on doing things perfectly can lead people to kind of get paralysis by analysis and not actually do anything because they're not willing to do anything that isn't perfect. It can also lead them to be people pleasing, which can be problematic when you're in an environment where you can't say no to food, or if they're trying to please me as a coach. But we're going to get onto that a little bit later when we talk about agreeableness. They can also be way too hard on themselves. So it's really important to find a balance between keeping yourself accountable and not being overly hard on yourself. And that's something that a lot of people struggle to do. There is a balance to be had there. It's not just like, being as hard on yourself as possible is important, that you've got to also be kind. You've got to find the right balance, and finding that right balance is wisdom, right? Like you need to have the wisdom and wherewithal to know when you need to push yourself harder and when you need to give yourself a break. And the other pitfall of conscientious people is that they can tend to take on too much and then spread themselves too thin. And then again, they beat themselves up for not being able to do everything perfectly, but really they're just holding themselves up to very, very impossible standards. So part of the work that I do with very conscientious individuals is about getting them to kind of be kinder to themselves and give themselves a break, right? Whereas another person who maybe struggles to keep themselves accountable, I might need to give them a bit of a kick up the bum. I might need to keep them accountable. I might need to remind them that, you know, they haven't made progress or that they need to do X, Y, and Z to make progress. For someone else, if I do that, that just feeds into their already overly self-critical nature. And I actually have to teach them how to have a little bit of self-compassion and how to give themselves a little bit of a break. So as a coach, I need to have different approaches for different people. Also, if you combine conscientiousness with neuroticism, which is negative emotion, and agreeableness, which is a kind of people-pleasing tendency, you can end up in a situation where they also just don't listen to their feelings or their own bodies enough. Now, there is the flip side of that, right? People who listen to their feelings way too much and give their feelings way too much space and time and attention. Oh, I feel like eating this. I feel like eating that. Or I felt sad, so I ate food, right? But there is the other side of that is not listening to your body at all. Again, there's a balance to be had in the middle. It's not one or the other. So conscientious people can do the hard work, but they tend to not know how to give themselves a break. And that can often be their downfall. And just to give you kind of a really solid example is I've seen lots and lots of women who are very, very conscientious and ambitious, have good careers, things like that, who kind of get stuck in this pattern of under eating during the day and being starving, hungry, and then ending up in a bit of a binge in the evening, and then kind of repeating the cycle over and over again, just being incredibly hard on themselves. Like, no, I have to do this. I have to be able to not eat during the day, or I have to be able to eat almost nothing during the day. And I need to be able to just push through hunger. And I should be able to get through to the evening and only have a small dinner. It's impossibly high standards that don't actually make any sense. And if they actually just lowered their standards and what they expect of themselves, they'll get much better results. Okay, so number two, personality trait number two is neuroticism. And that sounds quite, negative, like to call someone neurotic, but neuroticism is basically the experience of negative emotions. And some people just experience much more negative emotions than others. And this can affect how you deal with food and what you struggle with fat loss in three ways. The first way is emotional eating, right? That's probably the most obvious way. People who experience very negative emotions, have very strong emotions of shame or guilt, or, beating themselves up, or, feeling bad about things, or feeling down, or feeling depressed, or feeling like it's all their fault. They often end up with much more emotional eating tendencies and need to, release the stress or the pressure in some way through that, which is, I think that's obvious how that contributes to weight gain or not getting the results you want. The second way is that they have lots and lots of cognitive distortions. For example, all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, blaming, regret orientation. So for example, with catastrophizing, if they overeat at the weekend, they tend to go, oh my God, I've ruined all my progress. It's the end of the world. I'm just going to give up. There's no point. I have no self-control. Or blaming, they'll often blame themselves or others. But like in terms of blaming themselves, they'll say like, oh, I went to a social event and I just couldn't control myself and I just overate and I should have been much more, rather than sort of like understanding that the situation they were in with lots of yummy food around them for all day long was just a situation that's very hard to deal with. They can be very all or nothing about things. So, if I don't do all of my workout, then I failed. And they can also have a lot of regret orientation. So if they did things wrong or made mistakes or slipped up, which is inevitable and everyone is going to do on the process, everyone is going to make mistakes, they tend to spend a lot of time ruminating about that and beating themselves up about it instead of just focusing on what they can first of all, what they can learn, and second of all, what they can do now moving forward, what they can control that's ahead of them, what's in their control now, rather than obsessing over what they did or didn't do and what they should or shouldn't have done. So I spend a lot of time working with those people, on people who do have high levels of neuroticism or negative emotion. We spend a lot of the time on the coaching working on those cognitive distortions, right? Identifying. So I use CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and we identify the cognitive distortion for what it is, not a true reflection of reality, rather than an interpretation of reality that's erroneous and unhelpful and causes the person to spiral. And then we correct it with a more objective view of reality and with a more helpful thought. It's not positive affirmations. It's not kind of like pretending there isn't a problem. It's just correctly identifying reality and labeling reality correctly, rather than spinning about something that isn't actually true in the first place, or making a mountain out of a molehill and getting all worked up over something that really doesn't matter that much. So that's something that neurotic people tend to do a lot. And then also fear. They have a lot of like, what if it doesn't work? What if I do it wrong? What if I can't do it? And instead of trying and then trying to figure it out as they go along, they spend a lot of time worrying about what if scenarios rather than actually just putting it in practice. You're not going to think your way out of these problems. I often say to people, it's like riding a bike, right? Learning how to lose body fat is like riding a bike, in that you can't just read it from a book. You can't just be explained it to somebody. You have to actually get on the bike and fall off it and try again and try. And, my kids have learned how to ride bikes, and they make every single possible mistake 10,000 million times in order to learn what they actually need to do to get the bike to go in a straight line and not crash into anything and not smash the brakes and that kind of thing. And it's kind of the same with fat loss. You need to learn, and you need to learn through doing and through making mistakes. And if you have the right mindset about it, every mistake you can learn from it and then do it better in the future, instead of just spiraling and spinning out about the mistake. So neurotic people tend to be very reactive, and they tend to listen to their feelings too much. So, I mentioned how conscientious people can sometimes not listen to their feelings enough, but neurotic people can sometimes give them too much space and think that they're really good guides when they're actually not. Now, obviously, you can be conscientious and neurotic. So you care about doing a good job, but you're also incredibly hard on yourself a lot of the time, or, feel a lot of negative emotion around the process. And that can be a combination too. And then the third way that neuroticism can be kind of get in the way is how it affects your response to feedback or criticism. So obviously a big part of my job is pointing out what people are doing wrong. Okay, like coming along and like I kind of do when someone comes to work with me, I basically like do an audit of their life, right? I look at what they're eating, I look at how they're working out, and then I tell them, okay, well, if you do this instead of this, you'll get better results. And then the whole process is basically whether someone's with me for 3 months or a year, it's basically a process of that, of getting them to do the right things, getting it to be habit, of re-education, but basically, and stop doing the things that are getting them bad results or not getting them the results that they want. So I have to give people a lot of feedback. And some people are highly, highly sensitive to any sort of feedback if it's deemed negative or critical. And they can get very, very sensitive and very, very defensive. And obviously this is a scale, just like everything else, right? It's like a spectrum, to use the parlance of today. Some people, some of my clients are just like, just give it to me straight, Jen. Just be really direct with me. I don't want any beating around the bush. I love the fact that you're direct. And that's obviously the easiest thing for me to deal with, because then I can just tell people how it is. And people often appreciate it. And it's very hard for us to see everything clearly about ourselves. We have a lot of blind spots, and that's where working with a coach can be really, really helpful. Is a good coach can tell you, what you're doing wrong, but then also, correct you on certain things or show you your blind spots. And that's impossible for you to see on your own. Some people are very, very sensitive to that. Now, I obviously have a certain filter because I'm very direct online. I do have a certain filter already. Certain people won't come and work with me if they are, big snowflakes. But some people do find the feedback harder to digest than others. And I have had a couple of really sensitive people that take it really, really personally and get really, really upset. And it's impossible to get anywhere with them because they're constantly getting upset about the feedback rather than just making changes and learning. And they're hard on themselves, they're hard on me. And it's very, very difficult if you're hypersensitive to feedback. Again, these are all personality traits that to a certain degree are genetic and we can't really change about ourselves. But there are tools we can learn. So I'm quite a neurotic person. I'm quite prone to negative emotion. And I know that's true about myself throughout the lifespan. But through things like CBT, I have learned how to identify erroneous thoughts that are not helpful to me and then correct them. And I did that through like writing and doing it and working with a therapist. But then I continue to do it every day, like in my head. And it's a very, very, very important thing to do. And they are skills that you can learn, but you need to correctly identify that trait about yourself in the first place. Okay, so moving on to the next personality trait. This isn't actually a personality trait from the big five, but I couldn't quite figure out how to fit it into that. And I think it is actually one of the most important ones. And it's agency or like personal responsibility or independence or something like that. Now, agency is the idea that, you know, we can call someone like agentic, right? That they have agency. And that means that the person can sort of decide to do the right things for themselves or change certain things. Even if it's non-conforming. So a good example of somebody who's very, very agentic is Elon Musk, right? He's like, I want to fly to Mars. And then he just goes and like fucking does it, right? Like most people are not that agentic. And whatever you think of him as a person, if he comes up with a way that he wants to live his life or a thing that he wants to do, he finds a way to, you know, mold the universe to make it happen rather than just being like, oh, it can't happen. And so there's a kind of scale, a spectrum from agency to conformism, right? And a lot of people do tend to conform or not do things out of the box if it's like a little bit weird. So I think the way that this most affects fat loss is partly, you know, when you're at a party or whatever, doing some like, you know, saying no. But I think the main way is like in creating a life that like works for you and that is actually good and making choices that not necessarily everyone makes. Now, I'm somebody who, you know, I lift heavy weights, I watch what I eat, and I try to be quite lean, and I am quite health conscious in that way and quite, you know, focused on getting good results. But that makes me a little bit of a weirdo in a lot of people's eyes. A lot of people around me think it's strange that I work out and lift heavy weights. They don't, you know, a lot of women don't like the idea of doing that. And it's a bit of a strange thing to do still. Or when I go around on my rollerblades, or when I go for runs, or when I'm cycling with all my kids loaded in a bike trailer, like people think that's a bit weird. And it can be quite hard to be, there's a lot of good things about getting very lean and getting very muscular and, you know, looking the way that you want to look and feeling the way you want to feel, but it does tend to get a lot of kind of weird looks from other people, and it makes you kind of stand out in a bit of a weird way, and you have to kind of be a bit agentic to do that. But also you have to be quite agentic to do things differently from the way other people, and that's especially true if you're in an environment like the US or the UK, where everyone is a bit overweight and people tend to eat and drink too much. If you do something a bit different from that, that's considered a bit weird, and it's quite hard to do. It's quite hard. It's not necessarily because other people think it's weird. It's because you think it's weird. It's because other people are doing X and it's difficult to do Y. And if you're somebody who's very agentic, you will just make those things happen because they're good for you and they're going to get the results that you want. Whereas if you're somebody who's more conformist and doesn't have that much agency, you will struggle to make those changes because you'll tend to want to be more like everyone else, or think that it's not possible because you want to be more like everyone else. It's also true of sort of creating a lifestyle that lends itself to being healthy, right? So I run my own business, right? And I've basically reverse engineered my life to suit me as a person. So I want to have a big family. I want to have lots of kids. So, you know, I don't like working for a boss. I don't like commuting. So I work for myself, and I've built a business where, you know, I think I'm pretty successful. You know, I earn decent money, but I also don't have to leave the house. I don't have to sit in traffic. I don't have to answer to a boss. And I do things my way, but it also means that when I have a sick kid, I can stay at home, or when I have like a ton of housework to do, I can do that first before starting work. I can play with it a lot. And I often at the moment, or since my daughter was born, my third, most weeks I only work about 30 hours a week, sometimes less, because I just don't have time for more. And you do need quite a lot of agency to do that kind of thing, and to create a life rather than, you know, just going and working 40 hours a week because that's what everyone does. When I think working a 40-hour week with a commute doesn't make sense if you are the mother of young children, because you don't have enough hours in the week to do it all unless you have a lot of childcare. So I've created a life where I can get my workouts in, get my housework done, look after my kids and work, but I've got enough time for each of them rather than kind of always scrambling to get everything done because that's how other people do it. So when you have more agency, you'll do more things that are, you'll shape your life to suit you rather than, you know, what other people do. And the other way that agency works, kind of what I mentioned before, is that, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not a builder or a programmer where I can do the work for you. I tell you what to do. I help you overcome the hurdles and give you the right information. But to a certain degree, you have to accept that you are going to have to do it. You're going to have to lift the weights. You're going to have to do the diet, and I can't do it for you. No one can do it for you, right? And my job is to create the structure and the knowledge, but also give all of the support necessary. So my clients have unlimited WhatsApp support from me throughout the week. I give a ton of support and sometimes a lot of hand-holding depending on the person. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have to do it. And agentic people with agency will just realize that and will do it at the end of the day. Whereas some people do struggle more with agency and struggle to do those things for themselves at the end of the day or to implement the things that they're learning. Okay, number 4 is a big one. It's organization and time management. And I'm going to try and distill this down to a few things. So first of all, we can break this down to a few different things. But first of all, there is just, organized and disorganized, right? And this comes under the personality trait of conscientiousness, where it's half to do with industriousness, which is how productive you are, and then the other half is orderliness, how much you put things into order. And some people are just incredibly organized, right? They already have a family meal plan, they already cook certain nights of the week, they already have certain structure to their lives. And I come in and I help them build more structure or tweak the structure. Some people are incredibly disorganized, right? They eat just at random times. They just graze and just nibble at things throughout the day. They eat at very, very erratic meal times and have no structure to their day. They sometimes snack and they sometimes have a big meal, and it's just there's absolutely no structure or, limitation to it whatsoever. And it's often, based on what I feel like having and just kind of going with feelings. But disorganized people often tend to have a lot of, other things going on in their lives simultaneously that also are not organized. So their house won't be organized or, whatever. And it might be that it comes up in different areas, that this area of your life you're incredibly disorganized, but at work you're incredibly organized. That totally happens as well. But the more disorganized you are, the more you'll struggle to kind of figure this stuff out, because it's just all over the place and you end up getting decision fatigue. So what I find is that disorganized people often tend to struggle with set meals, creating and executing a meal plan. They often feel very limited by plan and structure. They often want to go with their impulses and their feelings. But then they feel very limited by plan and structure, but they feel very overwhelmed without it, and they get a lot of decision fatigue. Again, this is still something that you can learn. And what I do with all my clients is I start with a basic meal structure, right? Breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack and dinner, four meals every single day, 4 hours apart, 8 a.m., 12, 4 p.m., 8 p.m. Obviously, that's not going to suit everyone. We adapt it to suit the person. But the more disorganized someone is, the more they won't stick to that plan. They'll have things at different times, or they'll try and tweak the plan to accommodate every single, possible eventuality, rather than just saying, okay, it's just worth having a structure, even if sometimes I don't stick to it, or if other things come up. The more organized someone is, the more they like that kind of structure and rigidity in their lives, and it helps them create order. And when there's disorder, when you just have nothing that's anchoring you whatsoever, and that's what disorganized people often have, is they just get very, very, very overwhelmed with all the details, because they're constantly throughout the day going, when should I eat? Should I eat now? How much should I eat? Should I just have a snack, or should I have a meal? Should I have a big meal, or should I have a little meal? And I'm going to have this later, so maybe I should have this. And they're constantly getting bogged down with details, and get a lot of overwhelm and decision fatigue. Whereas if you just stick to a structure and just automate it, and just eat at those 4 times a day, figure out certain meals that you can just rinse, repeat, keep it nice and simple, keep it nice and boring. You can make the plan more complicated over time, but that basic plan gets rid of a lot of decision fatigue and a lot of noise. So there is just that element of it, that some people struggle with organization. They are just disorganized. I tend to find that disorganized people also tend to have a lot of chaos going on elsewhere in their lives. Like it kind of feels like everything's in the air all the time in lots of different areas. And they start a lot of projects that they don't finish. So they're always spreading themselves very, very thinly. And it makes it very hard to focus on fat loss for a length of time. But I find that also a lot of disorganized people find it very hard to accept that there are limits on their time. And so they try to do everything, and they spread themselves too thin. And then they feel a constant stress and time pressure that then makes them more scatty. Rather than saying, okay, I think it's 168 hours in a week, and I need this many for sleeping. I need this many for looking after my kids. I need this many for housework, and I need this many for working out, and I've got this much left over. They do it backwards. They sort of say, I want to do this, and this. It all adds up to 300 hours a week, and they're constantly trying to keep up with 300 hours a week of work. And they find it very hard to recognize that there are limits on their time and energy, and they just can't do it all. And they have to limit things, including, what they're doing with their children as well, because they don't have unlimited time to, parent and be with their kids if they want to work and do other things. Other people are very good at this and understand that, they need to divvy up their time between different things. And this then bleeds into time management. Some people have very poor time management, but I think that often people have poor time management because they're trying to do so many things, and because they're trying to fit 300 hours of things into a 168-hour week, and they're not accounting for that. I think that good time management starts with that, realizing that there are limits, and that it's kind of, the work's never done. You just have to stop, right? You use the allotted time that you have housework, and then even if the house isn't up to shape yet, you still have to just move on and start working, or whatever else it is. Just like you have a deadline, you have to pick your kids up at a certain time. It's like that with other areas of your life as well. And then another element of organization and time management is that a lot of people with ADHD, and I'm saying this as a person with ADHD, struggle with the execution side of things. So they struggle with executive functioning. So I work with a lot of people with ADHD, and they're very, very, very good at planning. They come up with a plan, but then they really struggle to just execute that plan, because in the moment they're a bit too impulsive. They go with their feelings. They're going with what they're doing. They diverge from the plan, and then they every week or every day they'll make a new plan instead of just executing the plan that they have and then tweaking it slightly over time. So they spend all their time planning, way too much time planning, right? Like you could get a plan done in like 10 minutes and then you just need to execute that plan. But if you keep making plans over and over and over again and struggle with the actual execution of it, no plan will ever work unless you actually execute it. And a lot of people struggle with that. And it's more of it's an executive function issue. It's the execution side of things that is difficult. Like the planning isn't actually the difficult part. The organization in theory isn't necessarily the difficult part. It's the implementation of that plan. And some people struggle to do both. Some people struggle endlessly to make a plan, and they're months into the program and they still don't have a basic plan, and they're also not executing on the things that we've agreed on. And that's really, really, really hard. It's a really hard problem for me to solve. I can point it out, but it's very difficult to solve. And the person actually has to just, I think the solution in this case is to just, if you realize that you're very, very bad at planning or very bad at executing a plan, you just kind of need to, executing is a bit different because again, it comes back to you doing it. But I think the best thing you can do is outsource. So it would just be to outsource to me, right? To just delegate to me. I make a plan for you. I tell you, just do this. And then you give me feedback on how it goes. And then I can make suggestions for adjusting the plan, and then you just have to execute it. Okay, so that would be the best kind of piece of advice I can give for people who do struggle to make a plan, and kind of always trying to tweak it to make it perfect. Okay, so the fifth personality trait, which again doesn't fit into the big five, but I think it's really important here, is impulsivity. And that plays a bit into the planning side of things and all of that. But some people have quite poor impulse control, and other people have very good impulse control. So they feel like doing something and then they either act on that desire or they don't. And that's ultimately discipline, right? Like not doing something that you want to do or saying no to something that you want to do in order to achieve something else that you also want, right? So saying no to one thing that you want so you can say yes to something else that you want. And it also is the ability to defer or delay gratification. So some people sort of really need they really need the instant gratification, and they really struggle to not act on that instant gratification. Whereas other people are able to say, no, I'm not going to eat this piece of cake because I'm trying to lose weight right now, or I'm not going to, do this because I want to do that. I want to achieve that. Other people really, really struggle with that. And again, there's an over focus on feelings and what you feel like and what you feel like eating. And there's also a stimulus seeking type behavior that comes along with that. Some people, again, this is a very ADHD thing, which I'm saying as a person with ADHD, is that but some people without ADHD have it as well. It's like seeking stimulation. So like addicted to phones, addicted to screens, always needing something going on in the background, struggling with quiet. And food often plays into that because it's also a stimulus that we seek out, right? We're seeking some kind of stimulus, some kind of physical, pleasurable sensation. A lot of people who are like sort of adrenaline freaks then resort to food when they have kids because it's a lot harder to find those sort of like adrenaline rush sort of situations. Again, I think this is something that you can learn, but it starts with identifying it about yourself and then working on it, and you can improve it. It is a skill that you can work on, or maybe like a muscle that you can work on. I also think when you're doing the right kind of diet, so like a lot of people give into impulses because they're starving hungry on a fucking stupid like diet where their calories are ridiculously low and they're hungry all the time, and so they're giving into their impulses because of that. And that's just setting you up for failure. So you have to get the hunger piece right. You have to get the calories right. You have to get all of that stuff right. And that improves it for a lot of people. Having a plan, knowing, okay, I'm not going to eat now because I'm going to have my lunch in another hour. That also helps a lot of people. But it is, at the end of the day, a muscle that you can strengthen. And I think it's one of those things where, action comes first. You don't eat the thing, you don't do that, you go and do your workout even though you don't feel like it, then you get the result, and then you feel motivated as a result of your actions rather than sort of like feeling motivated first. Okay, you're not always going to feel motivated to not eat the cake or to go and do your workout, but doing it gets you the results that you want, which makes you more motivated to keep going because you're getting results and it's worth it. Okay, number 6 is agreeableness, which I touched on before. So agreeableness is a really important personality trait to understand because on average, women are more agreeable than men. And this is what is colloquially called people pleasing, right? And if you're a people pleaser, I prefer the term agreeable, right? You end up getting into a lot of trouble or getting yourself very frustrated or not feeling content with a lot of situations because you're pleasing other people. And the way that agreeableness is an interesting one because it's split up into 2 different areas, compassion and politeness. Now, I am just like a point of interest is that I'm very middle of the road when it comes to agreeableness. So I'm 43rd percentile when it comes to agreeableness. So I'm about as agreeable as the average person, right? But I score very highly in compassion, but very, very low in politeness. Okay, so what that means is that I see other people's pain. I see what people are going through. I empathize. I understand. I'm good at seeing and understanding how people are feeling. But I'm also not polite, so I tend to be very direct and honest, and that actually lends itself extremely well for coaching because I have a really good idea. I'm really good at like tuning into people and reading people and understanding what's going on in their minds. But I'm also not scared of telling them, where they need to make changes or what they're doing wrong, because I'm not very polite. However, a lot of women score very high in compassion, but also very high in politeness. So they end up very, very agreeable and they find it very, very hard to say what they think. And the way this shows up with fat loss or with weight in general is number 1, they find it hard to say no. So if they're in social situations where someone's offering them food, even if they're not hungry or they don't particularly like the food, they find it very difficult to say no instead of just saying, no, thank you, I'm not hungry, or no, thank you, I don't particularly like X, which isn't difficult for someone like me, who I'm not very polite. So it's quite easy for me to say no to that thing because my agreeableness doesn't come from wanting to please other people. I'm not a people pleaser. The relatively high score that I have in agreeableness comes from compassion and understanding other people. But I don't need to be always, polite in order to be compassionate. The second way agreeableness kind of gets in the way is they're often, women who are very agreeable often struggle when it comes to dieting around their children. They don't want their children to see them weighing or measuring or tracking or saying that certain foods aren't healthy or things like that, which I've talked about in other podcasts about how I don't think we should hide these things from our kids and I think we should talk to them about it, but that's not for now. But they do tend to struggle. They think that they should just kind of blend in with their children, blend in with what everyone else is doing, and that they should never show any signs of, doing something different because that might be damaging somehow to the children. Number 3 is it can show up in the coaching in that they will try to please me rather than do what is right for them. So they'll try to sort of like, if I make a suggestion, they might sort of feel like that they have to say that, yeah, that's worked for me and I feel so much better, rather than saying, no, actually that didn't work, or I don't feel like that's going to work, or I don't like that idea. And they find it very, very difficult to be assertive and push back, which can be even harder when you're in front of somebody who is very assertive, like myself, right? Whereas, the irony is that when somebody is very assertive, like I am, I really don't mind when other people are assertive. Like I'm the last person that's gonna be offended or upset by it. And then the 4th thing is that they will tend to put everyone else first and everyone else's needs first rather than their own. And I'm not one of these people who's like, go, girl boss, like go and like do whatever you need to do and forget your kids, forget your husband. Like you don't need to please him. You don't need to make other people happy. Do what suits you. I'm not one of those people, right? I think we need to balance things. Like we need to balance everything in a family or with friends. And we need to find win-win scenarios that works for everyone. And sometimes we need to compromise. But that is, there's a balance to be had as well, right? Being overly selfish is no bueno, but being overly like having mummy martyr syndrome and just doing everything for everyone else and never putting yourself first or never meeting your own needs tends to get you frustrated, burnt out, and unhappy with where you're at. Number 7 is openness. And I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying about agency. Like being okay with doing things differently. So this also, is split up into 2 different things. Like being open to doing things differently. So people have habits, people have like a way that they like to eat. And, if you don't change anything, nothing's going to change, right? If you keep eating, some people sort of want to keep doing exactly what they're doing and somehow get different results. And they're not particularly open to different ways of doing it. And that's very hard. So a really extreme example I'll give you is I had one client who she didn't last very long, but she said, I really love to sit in front of the TV and eat cereal, dry cereal, straight out of the cereal box. So I know your approach is all about weighing and measuring and understanding portions, but I like to kind of get lost in it and not know how much I'm eating. Do you have any hacks for like doing that without? And I was like, you can weigh out your portion and then put it back into the cereal box and eat it out of it. She's like, no, because then I know how much I'm eating. And I'm like, yeah, but that thing that you're doing is keeping you overweight. Like you can't just eat mindlessly as much as you want of foods, of calorie dense foods and expect to lose weight. Like you can eat those foods, you just have to know what the portion is and how many calories are. And she really couldn't sort of get the point. She really just wanted to keep on doing this thing. This is like a thing I really love doing. But if you're eating 1,000 calories worth of cereal every day in front of the TV, like you're not going to lose weight, right? So like a willingness to sort of make compromises or do things differently. And then number 2 is also openness to feedback, openness to mistakes that you might be making, right? Some people, again, are incredibly responsive. I find this really interesting in coaching, how sometimes I can, give someone feedback, say on their MyFitnessPal or some of the foods they're eating and suggest some changes. And they're like, oh my God, wow, this is so amazing, like mind blown. I didn't realize, and now I know exactly what to do. Great, I'm gonna go and do it. And then they get great results. Whereas some people are like very, very, very resistant to that change and want to keep doing the same thing and find it very hard to accept any feedback, any sort of, suggestion of change whatsoever. And then just to add, this isn't a personality trait, but I also find that sometimes people's worldview and political leaning also tends to have a big effect on how they approach this process. So this might be a bit out there, or you might sort of I would be interested to hear how people respond to this. But in general, I find that people who describe themselves as liberals or more left-leaning tend to find it very hard to accept trade-offs and compromises. They kind of want, they want to be able to eat their cake and eat it too. They want to lose weight and have the fun things that they want to eat. They want really great services and low taxes. They struggle to understand that trade-offs and compromises need to be made. Sometimes they don't want things to be hard. They often want life to be easy and fun and nice and like all the time, and don't always value that sometimes you have to put in really hard work and this process is going to be hard, and it's okay that it's hard. It's okay that things are hard. Like it's okay that it's difficult to lose weight, and that there is intrinsic value in doing hard things, and that gives you pride and self-esteem. They often also struggle to understand the unintended consequences of good intentions. So, for example, not telling your children that eating too much sugar is bad for them because you don't want them to have an eating disorder, or you don't want them to be, fearful about food, right? Very good intentions, but then it can cause them to eat too much sugar, and that can be unhealthy for them or cause them to have excess weight, which is gonna be a problem for them later in life. And similar, with ourselves, is realizing even though it's with, say, the body positivity stuff, very good intentions, but it's, got a lot of unintended consequences tagged onto it. And they tend to prioritize as much personal freedom as possible with no limits or restrictions of any kind. Whereas people who are more conservative or right-leaning tend to sort of really value hard work. They understand trade-offs and that you have to make sacrifices for certain things and make compromises. They understand that you have to commit to something and that it takes time, that there are often unintended consequences, like I mentioned before, of letting yourself eat whatever you want. There are unintended consequences downstream of that. And they take sort of personal responsibility and accept that there are limits and restrictions that need to be set to give us guardrails, and that's a good thing for us. You may agree or disagree with that, but that's what I tend to find comes through, I would literally say 100% of the time. And then all of this, when it comes together, ultimately, it comes down to one word that I've been thinking about a lot and been talking about with a couple of friends and with my clients, and that is the word coachable. How coachable are you? And someone who's coachable is curious and interested to learn about themselves and reflect on themselves, even if it means that they're making mistakes and they're discovering that. They're quite open to those sorts of things. They're quite open to the idea of making mistakes or things that they might need to change. They take personal responsibility and they don't blame others or expect others to do it for them. And they really, really want to learn and improve. And they're usually quite assertive in that they can push back if they disagree, and they can say no in their private lives if it's something, or change something if it's not working for them. And this creates a very coachable person who's going to do well with the process, right? Because a lot of these things that I talked about they're genetic traits, right? They're things that we can't necessarily change about ourselves, but self-knowledge is power, right? If we know more about ourselves, we know what our pitfalls are, and we know what things we need to work on or what things we need to change or improve. There are certain skills that we can learn, whatever our problem is, whether we're disorganized or whether we're a bit too agreeable, we can learn to implement certain things that then help us get out of those patterns that are unhelpful. And so there's certain things we can't control about this process, right? We can't control genetic traits. We can't control our personalities, right? But what we can control is how we we can't necessarily control how we react emotionally to events and things like that, but we can have an influence on that, and we can change certain things about ourselves, learn certain skills, and be more open to the things that are going to help us. So I guess what to take from this process is, are there any of these things that you identify, that I've talked about, that you can identify in yourself? Because just knowing it means that you can do something about it, or you can be aware of it, or you can choose differently. If you're unaware of it in the first place, there's nothing you can do about it, right? You're completely powerless. Then there's going to be certain things that you're going to be able to change, or work to certain strengths, or change certain weaknesses. And how open you are to that is largely going to determine how coachable you are, how well you're going to do on a coaching program. So I hope you found that helpful. There's a lot of information in this, but I really wanted to I did this podcast more for me than for you guys. I really hope it does help some of you, but I really wanted to get these ideas out of my head. So I'd really love to know your thoughts. I'd love to know what you think about all of this stuff. Let me know if it's helped you. And let me know if you are interested in one-on-one coaching, that's very tailored to not only your lifestyle and your preferences, but also to your personality and who you are. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments below.